Just before 1 a.m. on October 25th, 1942, a piece of paper was placed on a table in front of General Harukichi Hyakutake. He read it, said nothing, then picked up a pen. The message he sent to Rabaul contained one sentence. At approximately 11 p.m. the previous evening, the right flank had captured Henderson Field. Within minutes, the entire Japanese 8th Fleet began to move. Cruisers, destroyers, landing ships, all of them pushing toward the island to support the victorious forces ashore. At the same time, a few miles south of Hyakutake's command post, a man was standing in the mud, no boots, both hands burned raw, eyes red from 3 days without sleep. In front of him was a narrow rise in the jungle. And in front of that rise was something no military manual had a protocol for. A wall of Japanese bodies stacked chest high, blocking the line of fire from both machine guns. He stepped out of the fighting hole, pushed the bodies over with his bare hands, stepped back in, kept firing. Hyakutake's message said Henderson Field had fallen. The man who was supposed to let that happen hadn't gotten the memo. His name was John Basilone, Sergeant, 7th Marines, sixth son of an Italian immigrant tailor from New Jersey. Never finished school. Nobody in the Japanese chain of command knew his name. He wasn't in any of the operational orders. He was just a point on a defensive line that needed a body standing in it. This is the story of the longest night on Guadalcanal, about a Japanese general so certain of victory he announced it before it happened, and about the man his entire plan ran into and broke against. To understand why Hyakutake was that certain, you need to look at what he did before the attack even started. He called his staff together and told them to draft the formal procedures for accepting the American surrender, the protocol, the ceremony, every detail. His exact words on October 22nd were recorded. The time of the decisive battle between Japan and the United States has come. He was so confident of the outcome that he had the surrender preparations completed before a single shot was fired. That wasn't arrogance without foundation. The 2nd Sendai Division had fought across China, Malaya, Singapore, and Java. Every time they were handed an objective, that objective fell. No exceptions. And now Hyakutake had 7,000 of them personally leading the operation from the island himself. His men boarded ship with 10 days of rations. No more. An officer explained to anyone who asked they wouldn't need more. The campaign would be over before the food ran out. Nobody argued. 10 days was more than enough for the Sendai Division. Not one of those 7,000 men understood that 10 days wouldn't be enough. Not because the campaign would run long, but because they would never reach Henderson Field on schedule. To hit Henderson Field from the south, the direction least defended, the division needed to move 15 miles through roadless jungle. On October 12th, engineers started cutting by hand, axes, saws, machetes, no machinery, no vehicles, just men clearing a path, one stroke at a time, through the densest terrain on Guadalcanal. After 10 days, they had what became known as the Maruyama Road, 15 miles across 7 rivers, over ridge lines with no footing through valleys of knee-deep mud, through forests so thick that daylight never reached the ground. On October 16th, the division began to march. Every man carried his pack, his rifle, his ammunition, and by direct order, an artillery shell. The heavy weapons crews hauled disassembled gun parts on their backs. Cooking fires were forbidden. Noise was forbidden. They moved in complete silence, single file through the jungle. Day 1, no problems. Day 2, the heavy weapons crews started falling behind. Day 3, artillery shells began appearing along the sides of the trail. Then mortar rounds, then food rations. Nobody had ordered anyone to drop them. People dropped them because they had nothing left to carry them with. On the 4th day, Sergeant Hara stopped in the middle of the trail and opened his ration bag. He counted what was left. 2 days of food. He looked ahead. The jungle continued. No airfield, no open sky. He looked back down the length of the Maruyama Road. Artillery shells, mortar rounds, food tins, half submerged in the mud. He didn't record what he felt. He only recorded the fact. 2 days of food left, and the airfield was nowhere in sight. On the evening of October 21st, it became clear to Maruyama that his forces would not reach their positions in time. He put his men on half rations and postponed the attack to the 23rd. There was a problem with that decision. Sumiyoshi's force on the northern flank, responsible for the diversionary attack, never received word of the delay. At dusk on October 23rd, Sumiyoshi's infantry and 9 tanks attacked the marine line at the Matanika River right on schedule. American artillery destroyed every tank. The infantry was thrown back with heavy losses. Maruyama's main force was still struggling through the jungle. He postponed again. October 24th. Each delay was another day without fires, without hot food, without anything but the sound of 7,000 men slowly coming apart. But not one officer in the Sendai Division asked whether the plan should be reconsidered. They had come too far. The surrender protocol was already written. The victory signal had already been chosen. Failure was not in the script. On the evening of the 24th, Sergeant Hara opened his ration bag one last time. Enough for one day. He looked up through the canopy. No moon, complete dark. Somewhere ahead, through more jungle, was Henderson Field. Tonight had to be the last night. John Basilone was born in 1916 in Buffalo, New York. Sixth of 10 kids. Father was a tailor. The house in Raritan, New Jersey was crowded and never had much extra money. Nothing about the family suggested anything that would end up in a history book. Basilone left school before high school, not because he was lazy, but because the family needed him working. He caddied at a local golf course, carried bags for men who had things he didn't, took the tips, brought the money home. At 17, he joined the Army, not for idealism, not for adventure, but for 3 meals a day and a steady paycheck. The Army sent him to the Philippines, 3 years in Manila. He learned enough to hold real conversations. He learned cards well enough to win consistently, and he learned to field strip a Browning M117 heavy machine gun in complete darkness. Not because anyone required it, but because the machine had its own logic. And once he understood that logic, he could make it work under any conditions. His buddies called him Manila John, not because he was a great fighter, but because he wouldn't stop talking about the Philippines. In 1940, he transferred to the Marines. By the evening of October 24, 1942, Sergeant Basilone had positioned 2 M117 Browning heavy machine guns on a narrow rise along the Henderson Field defensive perimeter under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller. The Browning was a water-cooled heavy machine gun over 40 canale without ammunition, using a 250-round belt. When the water in the cooling jacket ran out after sustained fire, Marines used whatever liquid was available. That night, more than once, they urinated into the water jackets to keep the guns from seizing up. Basilone knew the weapon the way a mechanic knows an engine, where it failed under pressure, how to fix each failure in the dark, what it could do and what it couldn't. He looked out at the tree line, nothing visible. He turned and looked at his 16 men. Some of them were shaking, not from cold. Guadalcanal was never cold, but the kind of shaking that happens when a person knows something is coming and doesn't know exactly what. He didn't say much. Just one thing. Let them get close. 30 yards. Nobody fires before that. 30 yards. Close enough to see faces in the dark. Close enough that nothing in the field of fire between his guns and the tree line would be walking back into the jungle. He sat down, leaned against the side of the fighting hole, waited. In the jungle to the south, 7,000 Sendai soldiers were moving through the dark. Total silence. No voices, no fires, nothing but the sound of boots on wet leaves and the breathing of men who had walked 15 miles through hell and still hadn't stopped. They knew Americans were waiting somewhere ahead. They didn't know who. Around 8 p.m., artillery opened up from the west. Pistol Pete, the Japanese gun the Americans had been hunting for weeks without ever finding, started dropping rounds into the Henderson Field perimeter. From the north, Sumiyoshi's surviving forces joined in with mortars. The western and northern sky lit up in pulses. In their fighting holes, Marines ducked and waited. Nobody was counting what number of shelling this was anymore. Basilone didn't duck. He sat on the edge of his hole and looked south. The fire was coming from the west and north. Nothing from the south, no movement from the tree line in front of his position. He'd been on Guadalcanal long enough to know what that meant. When the Japanese made noise in one direction, it was usually because they didn't want you looking at another. He checked his ammunition belts one more time. Then he waited. At 1:15 in the morning, there was no warning, no sound before it, no voices, no equipment rattling against branches, just darkness. And then the darkness started moving. The 9th Company of Nasu's 3rd Battalion came out of the tree line, fast and low, weapons ready in the formations they had drilled hundreds of times. These were soldiers who had been fighting for 2 years. They knew how to move at night. They knew how to take a fixed position. They had done it everywhere they had ever fought, and the result had always been the same. They moved toward Barcelone's position. 20 yards, 25, 30 yards. Barcelone opened fire. Both Brownings fired at once. In the tight space of a tropical night, the sound didn't register as gunfire anymore. It was more like tearing, continuous, and even. No pause, no break. The first soldier went down before he understood what was happening. The second fell on top of the first. The third tried to shift direction, but there was nowhere to go. Both guns were set at crossing angles, covering every inch of open ground between the tree line and the rise. No direction to run, no place to drop and survive. Within 5 minutes, the 9th Company ceased to exist as a fighting unit. A second wave came out of the tree line. They stepped over the bodies of the first wave without slowing down. They had been trained since their first day in uniform that enough men moving fast enough would break the enemy's nerve before the ammunition ran out. It had worked every time they had ever tried it. 30 yards, Barcelone fired. A third wave stepping over the second, 30 yards. Fired, then more. Barcelone stopped counting. He just fired, checked the belt, called for the next one, fired again. Both hands moving on pure muscle memory. No thought, no hesitation, just doing what he had practiced 10,000 times. Somewhere in the middle of the night, one of the two Brownings went silent. Barcelone looked over. The right gun was down. The Marine on it was working the action in the dark, hands shaking, couldn't find the jam. He looked at the tree line. The Japanese were still coming. In seconds, they would identify the gap. He didn't call for anyone. Didn't wait for orders. He picked up a spare Browning and its mount, 90 lb of gun and steel, put it on his shoulder and ran. Not in a straight line, because a straight line crossed ground where Japanese soldiers were already filtering through gaps in the perimeter. He cut low and wide. Twice he ran into Japanese soldiers working through the gaps. Twice he used his Colt .45 without breaking stride. He reached the silent position, fixed the jammed gun in the dark, hands moving from memory, locating the feed problem, clearing it, cycling the action, chambering around. The gun fired again, under 2 minutes, start to finish. The Marine on the other gun said afterward that he hadn't looked toward the silent position the whole time Barcelone was gone. He was afraid of what he'd see. He just kept his eyes forward and kept firing. Around 3 a.m., the last belt went into the gun. Barcelone looked back toward the ammo point 150 yards behind his position. Looked at the tree line. Still movement. He told the man nearest him to keep firing. Then he ran back through the dark, picked up belts, and ran back toward the sound of his own guns. He loaded, kept firing. He described it afterward in one sentence. "I guess I went about 150 yards to get the ammunition, and when I got back, we kept on firing all night." That was his complete account of something other people would spend decades writing books about. Nobody knows exactly when Barcelone lost his asbestos gloves. By the time he noticed, he had already grabbed the barrel of the Browning with his bare hands to reposition the gun as the Japanese shifted their angle of approach. The barrel had been firing for hours. The metal smoked when it touched moisture. His right hand blistered immediately. His left hand followed. He didn't let go, not because it didn't hurt, but because letting go meant something he understood better than anyone else on that rise. Around 3 a.m., Barcelone looked out from his fighting hole and stopped. Not because the guns were empty, not because the Japanese had pulled back, but because what he saw had blocked both guns' fields of fire. The bodies had piled up, wave after wave, hour after hour, hundreds of men falling at the same distance in the same direction, stacking on top of each other. The pile was chest high, high enough that both Brownings were now looking at a wall of dead instead of at the tree line. Barcelone climbed out of the fighting hole. He stood in the open in the middle of the night under continuing artillery fire from the west in the tropical rain that had started falling sometime in the last hour, and pushed the bodies over with his burned hands. The Marines still standing did the same. When the field of fire was clear, Barcelone stepped back into the hole, kept firing. At that same moment, while Barcelone was standing outside his hole, pushing bodies, a piece of paper was placed on the table in front of General Hyakutake. Report from the right flank. Henderson Field had been captured. Hayakutake didn't verify it. He picked up his pen. The fleet moved. Inside his command tent, Maruyama stood listening to the guns from the south. They weren't getting quieter. They were getting louder. If Henderson Field had fallen, if the Americans were breaking, the fire coming from that direction should have been fading. Instead, it was steady and mechanical. Not the sound of a line collapsing, but the sound of something that had no intention of stopping. He stared at the field telephone on the table, waited. At 4 a.m., it rang. A voice from the other end, quiet and uncertain. The report of capturing the airfield was a mistake. A unit had crossed an open clearing in the jungle and mistaken it for the runway. They hadn't reached the objective. They didn't know where they were. Maruyama set the phone down. Outside, the guns from the south were still firing, steady as a machine. A staff officer who was in the tent that night wrote after the war. When I heard that, I felt a sense of foreboding come over me. At 4:30 a.m., Hayakutake recalled the victory message. The fleet had been underway for hours. At dawn on October 25th, pilots of the Cactus Air Force climbed into their planes at Henderson Field. The airfield that Hayakutake had reported captured was operating normally, runway intact, planes fueled. They took off and flew out over the water toward the Japanese fleet, still moving in to support forces that had supposedly taken the field. The fleet didn't expect American aircraft. The cruiser Ura was sunk. Several other ships were badly damaged. The fleet turned back. Maruyama didn't quit immediately. On the night of the October 25th, he ordered a second attack with what remained of his division. Those soldiers climbed back out of the jungle in the dark. Many hadn't eaten in 2 days. Many had been fighting since the night before. They stood up and walked back into the trees because that was what they had been trained to do. The result was the same as the night before. By dawn on the 26th, Maruyama wrote his report to Hayakutake in the clipped language of a Japanese officer. No word for failure, no complaints, just short, precise sentences. The line could not be penetrated, requesting permission to withdraw. Hayakutake gave the order. 7,000 Sendai soldiers turned around and walked back down the Maruyama road. They passed the things they had left on the way in. Artillery shells, mortar rounds, food tins, half submerged in the mud after days of rain. Nobody spoke. The wounded were carried. The exhausted were helped along. Of the 30,000 Japanese troops deployed to Guadalcanal, 1/3 died in combat. Another third died from malaria, dysentery, and starvation. The soldiers who came back called the island Jigoku no Shima, Hell Island. Word spread through Japanese units across the Pacific that Guadalcanal was a place men went to die. For the first time in the war, Japanese soldiers told each other they were afraid of a specific place on a map. In December 1942, a closed meeting took place at the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Japan's senior generals and admirals sat before Emperor Hirohito. No reporters, no public record. What was said wasn't known until classified documents were released after the war. The conclusion, Guadalcanal could not be held. It was the first time in the entire war that Japan formally decided to abandon a position it had taken. Nobody in that room used the word failure. They used phrases like strategic reallocation and adjustment of defensive lines. But everyone present knew what those words actually meant. Guadalcanal was the high water mark of the Japanese Empire. From that point forward, not one additional meter of territory would be taken. Only retreat, slowly at first, then faster, then not fast enough. In February 1943, Japanese destroyers moved quietly toward the shore in the dark. 11,000 soldiers boarded in silence. No ceremony, no speeches, no music. They left Guadalcanal the way people leave a place they want to forget. Quickly, without looking back, American reconnaissance aircraft found the empty beaches 3 days after the evacuation ended. Empty trenches, abandoned equipment scattered across the sand. The jungle already beginning to reclaim what had been fighting positions a week before. Guadalcanal ended not with a surrender or a final battle. It ended with silence. After the war, Japanese officers who survived wrote their memoirs. People read those books looking for answers to a question military historians had been asking for decades. Why did the Sendai Division, a unit that had never lost, fail on a small island in the South Pacific? The memoirs offered many explanations. Terrain, logistics, communication failures, disease, the false report, the delays. Not one of them mentioned the name John Basilone, not because they were hiding something, but because they didn't know his name. All they knew was that there was a point on the southern perimeter of Henderson Field that could not be broken. No matter how many times they hit it, no matter how many men, no matter which wave, a point that held while everything around it might have given way. Their training had no framework for what had stopped them. At 4:30 in the morning on October 25th, Hyakutake recalled his victory message. Too late to stop the fleet. Too late to change anything. A few months later, John Basilone was asked to accept the Medal of Honor. He turned down the offer to have President Roosevelt presented in Washington. He wanted the ceremony in the field with his unit. He received it on May 21st, 1943 in Australia. When reporters asked him what he wanted to say, he said, "Only part of this medal belongs to me. Pieces of it belong to the boys who are still on Guadalcanal." After the ceremony, the Marine Corps offered him a commission and a desk job in Washington for the rest of the war. He turned it down. He applied to go back to the Pacific. Denied. Applied again. Denied again. The third time he wrote, "I'm just a plain soldier and I want to stay one. I'm not an officer and I'm not a museum piece. My place is with my outfit." That time they let him go. On February 19th, 1945, Basilone landed on Iwo Jima in the first wave. Within hours, he had destroyed a Japanese blockhouse with grenades and demolitions and guided a tank trapped in a minefield to safety under direct fire. He was killed by a mortar round that morning, 28 years old. The legend of the invincible Japanese infantry, the force that had rolled through Southeast Asia in under a year, the division that had never lost, didn't end because of a brilliant Allied strategy. It didn't end because of American industrial power, or a naval battle, or a decision made in some office in Washington. It ended on a narrow rise of ground in the jungle of Guadalcanal. In the rain, in the dark, in front of a man whose name nobody on the other side ever learned, the sixth son of an Italian immigrant tailor, left school before high school, standing barefoot in the mud with two burned hands and no intention of going anywhere. The place was called Rabaul. In the middle of 1943, it sat on the northeastern tip of New Britain, inside a perfect natural harbor the Japanese had turned into the strongest position they held anywhere in the South Pacific. Simpson Harbor could anchor 100 ships at once. 5 concrete airfields ring the Caldera, Lacunay, Guadalcanal, Rapopo, Tobera, and Cavating. From the air, you could count more than 360 anti-aircraft guns dug in around the runways and the harbor. Tunnels ran for miles under the volcanic rock. Storage caves, command posts, hospitals, ammunition dumps. By late 1943, the Japanese had put more than 100,000 men into that one place. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, laborers. They were not hiding. They were waiting. Now think about what that meant in practice on Tarawa in November 1943. The 2nd Marine Division went ashore against a much smaller atoll garrison. The fighting lasted 76 hours. More than 1,000 Marines did not come back. On Peleliu, the 1st Marine Division and the 81st Infantry Division fought for 2 full months in coral ridges and caves. The casualty list ran well past 10,000. Those were small positions compared to Rabaul. Yet Rabaul never saw a single American or Australian division come ashore on its beaches. Not one amphibious assault was ever launched against the main harbor or the main airfields. The most heavily defended base in the entire theater was simply left alone. Now ask yourself the obvious question: how? How did the man who commanded the Southwest Pacific area, General Douglas MacArthur, decide that the strongest Japanese position in the region was the one he would not attack? The answer does not lie in any sudden burst of caution. It lies in 5 months of looking at maps, reading reports, and watching what happened when you tried to take a Japanese base the way the enemy expected you to take it. This is that story. Before we go any further, I want to say something plain. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, or anyone in your family served anywhere in the Pacific during those years, Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Solomons, the Philippines, anywhere across that ocean, I would be genuinely grateful if you left a note in the comments. What outfit were they with? Which island or campaign? How did they finally come home? Those family stories are the only place a lot of this history still lives. Archives have the official records. Your dinner table, your attic, your old letters. Those are the details no one else has. And every year there are fewer people left who can tell them. So if you have one, put it down here. I read every single one. Thank you. Let's go back to the beginning of 1943. The Japanese had taken Rabaul in January 1942 with almost no fighting. A few hundred Australian militia had tried to hold it. They were overrun in days. Within months, the Japanese engineers had turned the place into the main forward base for the entire Southern Theater. By the time MacArthur's forces were fighting their way up the Papuan Peninsula toward Buna and Gona, Rabaul had already become the hub. Every Japanese ship that ran the slot, every plane that flew south, every reinforcement headed for New Guinea or the Solomons moved through Rabaul first. MacArthur knew it. Washington knew it. The original plan was simple on paper. Take Rabaul. That plan had a name, Elkton. By February 1943, it had become Elkton III. MacArthur's staff laid out a series of 5 operations that would converge on Rabaul by the end of 1943 or early 1944. The final step was a direct assault on the harbor and the airfields. The numbers the planners put down were not small. Intelligence estimated the Japanese would have between 40 and 50,000 men in the immediate Rabaul area by the time the Allies arrived. Casualty forecasts for the final assault ran into the tens of thousands. Then came Buna. The fighting around Buna and Gona on the northern coast of New Guinea lasted from July 1942 until the last Japanese positions were wiped out on January 22, 1943. The 32nd U.S. Infantry Division and the Australian 7th Division did the bulk of the work. The ground was swamp and jungle. The Japanese had built bunkers out of coconut logs and coral. The 32nd Division went into the line with almost no jungle training. They suffered more than 10,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and sick. The Australians lost more than 3,000. MacArthur was in Brisbane, hundreds of miles away, pushing for a quicker finish. He wanted Buna taken fast so he could keep moving north. The pressure was constant. When the last Japanese soldier was killed at Buna, MacArthur flew up, looked at the battlefield, and then turned his attention back to the next objective, Rabaul. But something had shifted. From June through the middle of August 1943, a quiet pause settled over the planning rooms in Brisbane and Noumea. MacArthur, Admiral Halsey, and General George Kenney of the 5th Air Force spent weeks studying the same maps. They looked at the photographs coming back from reconnaissance flights. They read the prisoner interrogations. They added up the strength reports. Rabaul was not getting weaker. It was getting stronger. The Japanese were pouring men and guns into the place. The 5 airfields were fully operational. The anti-aircraft batteries were thicker than anywhere else the Allies had faced. The more they studied it, the clearer it became. A direct assault on Rabaul would be exactly what the Japanese had prepared for. The harbor and the airfields were ringed with interlocking fields of fire. The tunnels gave the defenders protection from bombing and artillery. Any landing force would have to cross open water, then fight uphill into prepared positions. In the last week of August 1943, the Allied leaders met at the Quadrant Conference in Quebec. Roosevelt and Churchill were there. The Joint Chiefs sat down with their British counterparts. MacArthur's original Elkton plan called for the capture of Rabaul. The conference made a different call. They decided to bypass Rabaul entirely. Instead of attacking the fortress head-on, they would seize smaller islands and airfields around it, places the Japanese had not fortified as heavily. They would build new air bases closer to Rabaul, then use land-based bombers and carrier aircraft to isolate the base. Cut the supply lines, let the garrison sit there while the war moved past it. MacArthur did not like the idea at first. He had spent months planning to take Rabaul, but the maps and the numbers from Buna were hard to argue with. The fortress had spoken. It had told him exactly where the Japanese expected the next big blow to fall, and once he understood that, he began to see where they did not expect it. That 5-month pause, June to the end of August 1943, changed the entire campaign in the South Pacific. It was not a pause of rest, it was a pause of calculation, and when the fighting started again, It would not look anything like what the Japanese had drawn on their own maps. The decision was not made in a single dramatic meeting. It came together slowly, piece by piece, in the map rooms at Brisbane and Noumea through the late summer of 1943. MacArthur had spent months studying the same set of aerial photographs and intelligence summaries. The pictures showed the same thing every time. Rabaul was exactly what the Japanese wanted an attacker to see. The harbor was protected by reefs and heavy guns. The 5 airfields were ringed with anti-aircraft positions and fighter strips. The volcanic ridges gave the defenders high ground in deep tunnels. Any force that tried to land directly on the main beaches would be walking into a prepared killing zone. The reports from Buna were still fresh. The 32nd Division had learned the hard way what happened when you attacked a Japanese position that had months to dig in. MacArthur looked at the map and saw something else. The Japanese had concentrated their strength at one point. That meant the ground around Rabaul, the smaller islands and the coasts of New Britain, was comparatively thin. If you could seize those places and build your own airfields, you could put land-based bombers within easy range of Rabaul without ever setting foot on the main base itself. The idea already had a name in the Southwest Pacific. Hit 'em where they ain't. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific forces, had been using the same thinking in the Solomons. General George Kenney, who ran the 5th Air Force, was pushing hard for more forward air bases. Both men saw the same problem MacArthur saw. A direct assault on Rabaul would cost far more than it was worth. In the first week of September 1943, the plan began to take formal shape. They would bypass Rabaul completely. Instead of 5 major operations ending with an assault on the harbor, they would conduct a series of smaller landings at carefully chosen points around the edges of the Japanese position. Each landing would give the Allies a new airfield closer to Rabaul. Each new airfield would let Kenney's bombers and fighters reach the big base with heavier loads and shorter flight times. The Japanese garrison would be left sitting in its tunnels while the war moved past it. The first 2 targets were on the western end of New Britain, Arawe, and Cape Gloucester. Arawe was a small peninsula on the south coast. The Japanese had a modest garrison there, but it controlled a potential route for reinforcements coming from the west. A landing at Arawe would cut that line and give the Allies a foothold. Cape Gloucester on the northern coast was more important. It had flat ground suitable for an airfield. If the Allies could take it, they could put fighters and medium bombers within striking distance of Rabaul itself. Further out, Halsey proposed something bolder. The Admiralty Islands north of New Britain were lightly held. A quick strike there could give the Allies another major airfield complex and complete the ring around Rabaul from the north. MacArthur approved the change in plan. The old Elkton operation was set aside. The new approach was simpler on paper and far less costly in lives. It relied on speed, surprise, and the ability to build airfields faster than the Japanese could react. The fortress at Rabaul had told them exactly where the Japanese expected the blow to fall. Once MacArthur understood that, he chose to go somewhere else. By the middle of November 1943, the orders were written. The first landings were scheduled for mid-December. The troops who would carry them out were already moving into position. The 112th Cavalry Regiment for Arawe, the 1st Marine Division for Cape Gloucester, and later the 1st Cavalry Division for the Admiralties. None of them were headed for Rabaul itself. The decision had been made. Now it had to be executed in the rain, in the mud of New Britain, where the ground itself would fight every step of the way. That is where the story moves next. From the map rooms to the jungle shoreline, the orders were clear and the landings began exactly as planned. On December 15, 1943, the 112th Cavalry Regiment, dismounted and fighting as infantry, went ashore at Arawe on the south coast of New Britain. The Japanese garrison there was small, but the ground was not. The peninsula was low, swampy, and cut by mangrove creeks. The cavalrymen waded through knee-deep mud under steady rain. Their job was not to take Rabaul. It was to cut the coastal track that the Japanese used to move supplies westward and to give the Allies a foothold on the southern side of the island. 2 weeks later, on December 26, the 1st Marine Division landed at Cape Gloucester on the northern coast. This was the bigger operation. The Marines had come from Guadalcanal, and they knew what jungle fighting looked like. What they found at Cape Gloucester was worse. The ground was called the Green Hell for a reason. Rain fell for days without stopping. The mud was so deep that men sank to their waists. Machetes were as important as rifles. The Japanese had dug in on the high ground around Hill 1660, and they fought from log and coral bunkers that had to be taken one at a time. The Marines did not charge straight at the main Japanese positions. They moved around them where they could, used the terrain, and let the engineers follow. Within days, the engineers were carving out an airfield on the flat ground behind the beach. They worked under intermittent shelling and sniper fire, laying pierced steel matting over the mud so that fighters and bombers could begin operating from Cape Gloucester itself. Further north, the next move was even more deliberate. On February 29, 1944, a date chosen partly because it was a leap year, and the Japanese were not expecting anything, a small reconnaissance force from the 1st Cavalry Division went ashore at Los Negros in the Admiralty Islands. The force was led by Brigadier General William C. Chase. It numbered only about 1,000 men at the start. They landed at Hyann Harbor after PT boats had slipped in the night before to check the beach. The Japanese reaction was fast and hard. Night counterattacks came in waves. The cavalrymen held the perimeter with small arms fire and whatever artillery they could bring ashore. MacArthur himself flew in the next day. He walked the beach, looked at the airfield the Japanese had started building at Mammoth, and told Chase to hold it. Reinforcements followed quickly. By the middle of March, the 1st Cavalry Division had taken both Los Negros and the larger island of Manus. The engineers moved in immediately. They repaired the Japanese runway at Mammoth and built a second larger field at Lorengau. Within weeks, the new airfields were operational. None of these landings were aimed at Rabaul. The pattern was the same at every step. The Allies took ground the Japanese had not fortified as heavily, built an airfield as fast as possible, and moved the front line of the air war closer to the big base. Each new field let Kenny's 5th Air Force put more planes over Rabaul with heavier bomb loads and shorter flight times. The Japanese garrison, sitting inside its tunnels and behind its guns, watched the ring grow tighter around them without ever seeing an American or Australian division come ashore on their own beaches. The men who did the work paid the usual price. The 112th Cavalry at Arawe spent weeks in waterlogged positions, fighting both the Japanese and malaria. The Marines at Cape Gloucester measured their days in inches of rain and yards of mud. One company commander later wrote that the biggest enemy was not the Japanese soldier in front of him, but the ground itself. The engineers who built the airfields worked at night under blackout conditions, so the Japanese bombers could not find them. They filled bomb craters, laid matting, and kept the runways open while the infantry held the perimeter. By the end of March 1944, the circle was complete. Rabaul was now surrounded by Allied airfields to the west at Cape Gloucester, to the south at Arawe, and to the north at the Admiralties. Kenny's bombers and fighters could reach the harbor and the 5 main airfields in minutes instead of hours. Supply ships could no longer reach Simpson Harbor without being spotted and attacked. The Japanese garrison of more than 100,000 men was still inside its fortress, but the fortress no longer mattered to the progress of the war. The Japanese had built Rabaul to be the place where any attacker would have to come. MacArthur had simply chosen not to come there. He had gone around. The ring was closed without a single landing on the main beaches of Rabaul itself. What happened next inside that ring is another story. Once the ring was closed in March 1944, the war simply moved past Rabaul. The Japanese garrison stayed exactly where it was. More than 100,000 men inside the tunnels and bunkers they had spent 2 years building. No American or Australian division ever landed on the main beaches. No fleet ever steamed into Simpson Harbor to force a surrender. And the big assault the Japanese had prepared for never came. What did come was isolation. Supply ships stopped arriving. The route through the Bismarck Sea was now covered by Allied airfields on 3 sides. Any vessel that tried to reach Rabaul was spotted within hours and attacked by land-based bombers or carrier planes. By April, most of the harbor was empty, except for a few wrecked hulks. The Japanese tried to run submarines in at night, but the numbers were never enough. Food, medicine, spare parts, and ammunition all began to run short. Inside the tunnels, the garrison settled into a new kind of routine. Men planted small gardens in any patch of soil they could find between the volcanic rocks. They hunted rats and lizards for extra protein. They repaired their own uniforms with whatever thread they could salvage. Medical officers worked with almost no supplies. Quinine for malaria ran out first, then sulfa drugs, then bandages. By the middle of 1944, roughly 1 man in 4 was listed as sick. Dysentery, beriberi, and tropical ulcers became ordinary facts of life. The air attacks never stopped. General Kenny's 5th Air Force flew mission after mission over the caldera. At first, they went after the 5 main airfields. Later, they shifted to the harbor installations, the supply dumps, and the road network. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns still fired, but they had no fighter cover left. The last operational Japanese aircraft had been withdrawn to truck months earlier. All that remained were the guns and the men who manned them. The tunnels protected them from the bombs, but they could not protect them from the calendar. And every week, the food ration grew smaller. Every month, more men went onto the sick list and never came off it. Japanese diaries recovered after the war show the same quiet progression. First, the hope that a relief force would arrive, then the realization that none was coming, then the long wait for an end that never seemed to get closer. The high command in Tokyo had already written the place off. Rabaul remained on paper as an important base, but in practice it had become a prison with no walls. The men inside it kept their weapons clean and their positions manned, but the war had moved 800 miles to the northwest. MacArthur was already planning the next leap toward Hollandia, then the Philippines. By the end of 1944, the garrison at Rabaul had lost its purpose. It still held the strongest defensive position in the South Pacific. Yet that position no longer controlled anything that mattered. The airfields outside the ring, Cape Gloucester, Araway, Los Negros, Manus had done their job. The Japanese could sit in their fortress as long as they wanted. The Allies simply went around it. The fortress had been built to stop an attacker. No attacker ever arrived, and that, more than any battle, was what finally defeated it. In the years after the war, MacArthur stood on the deck of a ship and looked toward Rabaul from a distance. The caldera was still there. The 5 airfields were still visible. The tunnels the Japanese had dug so carefully remained cut into the volcanic rock. Nothing had changed about the ground itself. What had changed was its place in the war. Rabaul had been built to be the one position no attacker could ignore. In the end, it was the one position the Allies chose to ignore. The numbers tell part of the story. The Japanese kept more than 100,000 men inside that fortress until the surrender in August 1945. By then, many of them were sick or starving, but the base itself had never been taken by assault. The cost to the Allies was the ground they took instead: Arawi, Cape Gloucester, Los Negros, Manus. Those places saw hard fighting and real losses, but the losses were measured in the thousands, not the tens of thousands that a direct attack on Rabaul would have required. The real story is not in the numbers. It is in the sequence of decisions. The 5-month pause in the summer of 1943 was not a delay. It was a recalibration. The fighting at Buna had shown what happened when you attacked a prepared Japanese position the way the enemy expected. The maps of Rabaul showed the same pattern on a much larger scale. MacArthur, Halsey, and Kenny read those maps the same way. They saw where the Japanese had concentrated their strength, and they chose to go where that strength was not. Every obstacle pointed in the same direction: the strength of the fortress, the cost of Buna, the limited shipping, the weather in the South Pacific. All of it told them the direct route was the wrong route. They listened. They went around. That is what the verdict comes down to. The side that read the situation as it actually was defeated the side that waited for the attack it had prepared for. The Japanese had built the perfect defensive position for the battle they expected. MacArthur declined to fight that battle. He fought a different one on ground of his own choosing at a time and place the Japanese could not control. The men who carried out the landings at Arawi and Cape Gloucester and the Admiralties did not think of themselves as part of a grand strategy. They waded through mud, built airfields under fire, and held perimeters at night. Their job was the next hill, the next runway, the next supply dump. They did that job, and because they did, the big fortress at Rabaul became irrelevant to the progress of the war. Today, you can still walk through the tunnels at Rabaul. The concrete bunkers remain. Rusting aircraft and guns still lie where they were left in 1945. The place looks exactly like the fortress it was built to be. But there is no large American cemetery on its beaches. There is no long list of names from a final assault that never happened. Obstacles are not always barriers. Sometimes they are signals. The fortress at Rabaul spoke clearly. MacArthur listened, and the war moved on. If you have not yet left a note in the comments about a father, grandfather, or uncle who served in the Pacific, this is a good time. Those stories belong here. August 19, 1945, Nichols Field, Manila. An American C-54 transport touched down on the runway and rolled to a stop in the Philippine heat. 16 Japanese officers stepped off the plane, full-dress uniforms, swords at their hips, medals pinned to their chests. They had flown 3,000 kilometers to arrange Japan's unconditional surrender. No one of significance came out to meet them. No reception tent, no chairs, no shade. Over 90 degrees on the tarmac. The 16 men stood and waited. Before leaving Japan, several of them had placed a small vial in the inside pocket of their uniform jacket. Poison in case the Americans turned out to be something other than gentlemen. Standing on that runway, they were beginning to wonder. General Douglas MacArthur knew they were coming. He had known for days. What he set in motion over the next 72 hours was not a negotiation. It was something older and more deliberate. The careful removal of everything these men had built their identity around. Not by force, not by open humiliation, but by making them wait in the August heat while he decided when to appear. This is the story of those 72 hours and the one detail that changes everything you think you know about how the Second World War actually ended. Lieutenant General Torishiro Kawabe had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not because he could not sleep, though he could not, but because he had made a decision about how he intended to look when he stepped off that aircraft. He put on his full-dress uniform before the sun came up. Every button fastened, every medal in its correct position. The ceremonial sword at his hip was long enough that walking with it required a deliberate adjustment at every step. He was not dressing for comfort. He was dressing for a message. Kawabe was the vice chief of the Japanese Army General Staff, the second-ranking army officer in Japan. He had not been chosen to lead this delegation because he was the most senior man available. Tokyo had made a calculation. He was senior enough to carry real authority, senior enough that the Americans would have to take him seriously, but not so senior that what happened to him in Manila would destabilize what remained of the Japanese government. Someone had thought through the consequences carefully. Kawabe understood this. He accepted it anyway. The delegation he led numbered 16 men in total. Army officers, Navy officers, a senior diplomat, translators, and aides. Each man had been selected for a specific function. Before they left Tokyo, they had been given a single clear instruction. Do not show emotion under any circumstances. Do not make eye contact with American enlisted soldiers. Do not remove your sword unless you are directly ordered to do so. Maintain the appearance of men who are present by choice rather than by necessity. Not every man believed he could do that. Some of them made quiet arrangements, a small glass vial, an inside pocket. Nothing said aloud. They were not the first soldiers in history to prepare for the possibility that capture would be worse than death. They would not be the last. They flew first to Ieshima, a small island in the Ryukyus that American forces had taken in April at considerable cost. At Ieshima, they transferred to an American C-54 transport, a large 4-engine aircraft they had never flown in before, operated by men they had been at war with for nearly 4 years. The flight from Ieshima to Manila took several hours. No one talked much. Below them was the Western Pacific, the same water that had swallowed Japanese warships by the hundreds over the preceding 3 years. The same islands where Japanese soldiers had fought to the last man rather than accept what Kawabe was now flying toward. Kawabe looked out the window for a long time. He was not a man who wrote extensively in his journal. His entries were typically short observations, times, names. On this flight, he wrote one line. He wrote that he had never in his life felt so tired, not physically tired, the other kind. He had spent his career inside a system built on the assumption that rank was its own form of protection, that a general officer, regardless of which army he served, regardless of which side had won, occupied a different category than ordinary men, that there were rules, that those rules would be observed. This assumption was not unique to Japan. It was the operating principle of professional military culture across every nation that had fought in this war. Officers on both sides had relied on it. Officers on both sides had at various points been right. Kawabe had no specific reason to believe the Americans would violate it, but he had watched enough of this war to know that the world he had operated in for 30 years was not the world he was flying into. He kept the vial in his pocket. He straightened his uniform. He watched the Philippine coastline appear below the wing, and he prepared himself for whatever a man prepares himself for when he is about to step off a plane into the hands of the enemy he spent 4 years trying to defeat. When the C-54 rolled to a stop at Nichols Field, the officer who came out to receive them was Major General Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's Director of Intelligence, not MacArthur. Willoughby was efficient. He was correct in the formal military sense. He did not smile. He did not offer a hand. He directed the 16 men toward waiting vehicles with the economy of motion of someone completing a routine task. The Japanese officers climbed into the cars. The doors closed. The motorcade moved. What happened in the next 20 minutes was not on any agenda. The route from Nichols Field into Manila passed through what had been 8 months earlier, one of the most beautiful cities in Asia. It did not look that way now. Manila in August of 1945 was the second most destroyed city in the entire Pacific War, behind only Warsaw. Block after block of collapsed buildings, roofless shells of what had been hotels, churches, government offices, streets that were still being cleared of rubble from battles fought earlier that same year. American and Filipino forces had retaken Manila in February of 1945. The battle had lasted a month. Japanese forces during their retreat had moved through the city's civilian districts with a violence that investigators would spend years documenting. Estimates suggest the civilian death toll in Manila alone exceeded 100,000. Kawabe looked out the car window. He had not been in Manila before. He had read reports. Reports and reality are different things when the reality is passing 12 inches from your face through a car window. He did not write in his journal about what he saw on that drive. Some things a man records, some things he does not. MacArthur was not at Nichols Field because he had chosen not to be. This requires some explanation because MacArthur was not a man who left details to chance. He had been appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, the single authority responsible for accepting Japan's surrender and overseeing its occupation. Every significant decision flowed through him. Every ceremony connected to Japan's defeat was his to shape. He had been thinking about how this would look since before Japan had formally indicated its willingness to surrender. The signing ceremony on USS Missouri was going to be his moment. Witnessed by the combined fleets, broadcast by radio to the world, recorded by cameras that would produce images printed in newspapers on every continent. He had been planning it with the attention to detail of a man who understood that history is made twice, once when it happens and once when it is remembered. Manila was not that moment. Manila was where the logistics got settled, where the requirements got delivered, where Japanese officers sat across a table from American officers and received instructions. MacArthur had a man for that. His name was Sutherland. Lieutenant General Richard Sutherland was MacArthur's chief of staff and had been since the early days of the war. He was precise, demanding, and cold. Cold in the way that some men in positions of authority use coldness as a tool, a way of establishing at the outset that warmth is not on offer and should not be expected. Officers who had worked alongside Sutherland for years described him in terms that did not include the word pleasant. He was waiting at City Hall when the delegation arrived. What remained of City Hall? The building had survived the battle for Manila in the way that a man survives a bad car accident. Functional technically, but with damage that would take years to repair. Kawabe walked through the entrance, his sword adjusted at his hip with each step. The delegation filed into a conference room. They took their seats. Sutherland entered. He did not sit immediately. He looked at the men across the table for a moment, the kind of look that takes inventory, and then he sat down and opened the folder in front of him. He was ready to begin. The list was specific. Sutherland did not read it aloud with ceremony. He went through it the way a man goes through a maintenance checklist, item by item, in order without editorializing. First, Atsugi Airfield outside Tokyo had to be completely cleared of hostile personnel before MacArthur's aircraft touched Japanese soil. Every armed unit in the vicinity had to be stood down and moved back. The perimeter had to be secured by Japanese forces willing to enforce it. Second, all Japanese combat aircraft within a prescribed radius of Atsugi had to be rendered inoperable before the landing. Fuel removed, instruments disabled. The aircraft were to present no threat of any kind. Third, the road between Atsugi and Yokohama had to be secured along its entire length. MacArthur's motorcade would travel that road. Nothing on it was to move except by American authorization. Fourth, MacArthur intended to land at Atsugi on August 26th. That gave Kawabe's government 7 days. Kawabe listened to all of it before he responded. When he did respond, he was careful and precise. He did not object to the requirements. He did not argue that they were unreasonable. He said that 7 days was not sufficient time to guarantee what was being asked of him. Sutherland's expression did not change. He said he would convey the concern to General MacArthur. The meeting continued. There was one moment during those first discussions that Kawabe would describe in detail in what he wrote afterward. At a certain point, Sutherland indicated that the Japanese officers should surrender their swords for the duration of the conference. Kawabe said no. He said it without raising his voice. He said it without elaboration. The sword was part of the dress uniform. To remove it in that room in front of American officers under those circumstances was a form of submission that went beyond what the conference required. Sutherland looked at him. The room was quiet for a moment, in the way rooms go quiet when two men are deciding how much a point is worth. Sutherland noted the refusal and moved on. He did not press it. He did not return to it. Kawabe kept his sword. It was in the end the only thing he kept from Manila, the only concession the Americans did not take. A small thing. He understood it was a small thing. He kept it anyway. The rest of that first day covered the logistics of occupation, port access, airfield transfers, the sequencing of troop withdrawals, the handling of Allied prisoners of war, still held in camps across the Japanese Empire. That last item took time. There were Allied prisoners in camps across Japan, Manchuria, Korea, China, the Philippines, in Southeast Asia. Thousands of them. Men who had been held for years under conditions the Red Cross reports had not fully captured. The Americans wanted them out, not eventually, immediately. Before the formal surrender ceremony, before the occupation formally began, Kawabe's delegation worked through the logistics hour by hour. That evening, the delegation was taken to their quarters, a building in what had once been a functioning part of the city. Rooms that worked, not much more than that. Kawabe sat down at the small desk in his room and wrote in his journal. He recorded the day's meetings accurately, the requirements, the timeline, the exchange about the sword. He noted that Sutherland was efficient and gave nothing away. Then he wrote something he had not planned to write. He wrote that driving through Manila that afternoon, he had seen a section of wall still standing in the middle of a cleared block. Nothing attached to it, nothing around it, just a wall with window frames and no building left on either side. He did not explain why he recorded this. He recorded it and stopped. The following morning, Kawabe sent a formal communication to Tokyo. He stated that the American requirements were technically achievable, but that the timeline was insufficient. He requested authorization to negotiate for additional time. Tokyo's response arrived within hours. The emperor had issued instructions that the delegation was to cooperate fully with all Allied requirements. There would be no negotiation of timelines. There would be no request for extensions. Kawabe was to accept the terms as presented and confirm the schedule. He read the message twice. Then he picked up his pen and drafted his reply to Sutherland, confirming that Japan accepted MacArthur's requirements in full and that the Supreme Commander could proceed with plans to land at Atsugi on the agreed date. He signed his name. He had told Sutherland the timeline was not enough. He had told Tokyo the same thing. Neither had changed the answer. He folded the communication, set down his pen, and sat for a moment in the particular silence of a man who has just committed to something he cannot fully control. The second day continued with more meetings. The conference table at City Hall had become a kind of fixed point, the place where the distance between what Japan had been and what Japan was now becoming got measured in specific practical terms. On the afternoon of that second day, one member of the delegation became ill. It was not serious. A fever, exhaustion, the accumulated effect of days that had not allowed for much sleep. There were no Japanese doctors present. An American military physician came instead. He examined the man, provided what was needed, and left. Kawabe recorded this in his journal with 2 words. He wrote, "He came," nothing more. Every message the delegation transmitted back to Tokyo passed through American equipment, handled by American operators, and was read by American intelligence officers before it reached its destination. Kawabe knew this from the first day. He composed his messages accordingly, formal, precise, stripped of anything that might be interpreted as resistance or used as a pretext for further demands. What he could not send, he wrote in his journal. On the evening of the second day, he wrote that the Americans he had dealt with were competent and showed no personal hostility. He wrote that Sutherland conducted the meetings as if the outcome of each item had already been decided, and the discussions existed only to produce a written record. He wrote that this was probably accurate. Then he wrote something that had nothing to do with the meetings. He wrote that he had heard through the open window of his room that night a group of Filipino civilians passing in the street below. He could not make out what they were saying, but he could identify the tone. He described it as the sound of people who had been waiting a long time for something to be over. He wrote that he heard it and could not sleep afterward. On the morning of the third day, Sutherland presented the final set of arrangements and asked for Kawabe's formal confirmation that Japan would comply with all of them. Kawabe had one remaining request. He asked whether MacArthur's landing date could be moved back by 48 hours. Not 7 days, not a week, 48 hours. Sutherland said he would ask. The answer came back within the hour. No, MacArthur's schedule would not change. Kawabe picked up his pen and signed the confirmation document committing Japan to having Atsugi ready, the road secured, the aircraft neutralized, and the Supreme Commander of Allied forces safely on Japanese soil within days. He had raised the concern twice. Both times he had been told no. He kept the pen and set it on the table. Sutherland collected the document, reviewed it briefly, and nodded once. The 3 days in Manila were over. Kawabe returned to his room. He packed his uniform for the morning flight. He placed the small vial carefully back in the inside pocket of his jacket, where it had been since Tokyo, and he waited for whatever came next. The problem had a name. Captain Yasuna Kozono commanded the kamikaze units based at the airfield. He had spent years training pilots for a single type of mission, one from which no one returned. When Emperor Hirohito's voice came over the radio on August 15th, announcing Japan's acceptance of surrender, Kozono did not stand down. He told his men the broadcast was a forgery. He told them the war continued. He flew his aircraft over Tokyo and dropped leaflets urging the military to keep fighting. He was not a fringe figure. He commanded real aircraft, real pilots at the exact airfield where MacArthur intended to land. Japanese Army and Navy officials eventually removed Kozono from command and had him confined. A breakdown, they called it, though the timing suggested it was also a solution to a problem that could not be allowed to continue. But this did not happen immediately. It happened days after Kawabe had already signed MacArthur's requirements in Manila, days after the commitment had been made. The insurrection at Atsugi was one reason MacArthur's landing was pushed back from August 26th to August 30th. 4 additional days for the Japanese side to bring the airfield to the condition MacArthur required. 4 days that Kawabe, sitting in Tokyo, could do very little to influence. On the morning of August 30th, General Douglas MacArthur boarded his personal C-54 transport on Okinawa. The aircraft was named the Bataan after the peninsula in the Philippines where American and Filipino forces had made their last stand in 1942 before being captured, before the Death March, before 3 years of Japanese occupation. MacArthur had chosen the name deliberately. Before takeoff, he turned to the officers traveling with him and told them to remove their sidearms. The order surprised some of them. They were flying into Japan. The peace treaty had not yet been signed. The formal surrender had not taken place. One of them asked why. MacArthur said, "If the Japanese intend to kill us, pistols will make no difference, and nothing will impress them more than arriving without weapons." The Bataan lifted off at 9 out in the morning with a pair of B-17s as escort and nothing else. MacArthur went to the back of the plane and took a nap. Below them, as they crossed the southern coast of Japan, was the country that had been the enemy for nearly 4 years. The same coastline that American planners had spent years studying in preparation for an invasion that would now not happen. Operation Downfall, the assault on the Japanese home islands, had been projected to cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and multiples of that on the Japanese side. The atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki had ended that calculation. MacArthur reportedly looked out the window as they passed Mount Fuji, the volcano rising above the clouds, white at the summit, unchanged by everything that had happened below it. He looked at it for a while, then he turned away. The Bataan touched down at Atsugi at 2:19 in the afternoon. More than 4,000 American troops from the 11th Airborne Division had already landed at the airfield in the preceding days. They were there. They were armed, but they were outnumbered. On every side of the airfield and along the roads beyond it stood Japanese soldiers, not hundreds, but thousands, still in formation, still armed, watching. MacArthur stood at the top of the aircraft stairs for a moment before descending. Corncob pipe, field marshal's cap. No weapon visible anywhere on his person. He walked down the stairs at a pace that suggested he was in no particular hurry, shook hands with General Eichelberger at the bottom, and said, "Bob, from Melbourne to Tokyo is a long way, but this seems to be the end of the road." Winston Churchill, when he was told what MacArthur had done, said it was the single greatest act of personal courage he had witnessed in the entire war. This was a man who had watched the Battle of Britain from London, who had been at Gallipoli, who measured bravery against a standard most men never approach. He called Atsugi the greatest of the lot. Kawabe heard the news by radio in Tokyo. MacArthur had landed. The airfield had been secure. The roads had held. He opened his journal. He wrote the date. He wrote that MacArthur had arrived at Atsugi without incident. Then he wrote one more line. He wrote that he had not been certain until that moment that it would go that way. He set the pen down and sat with that for a long time. MacArthur had 13 days between Atsugi and the Missouri. He used them. The choice of the Missouri itself had been made in Washington. President Truman selected the ship because it was named for his home state and had been christened by his daughter Margaret in January of 1944. That decision belonged to Truman. Everything else belonged to MacArthur. He determined where the signing table would be positioned on the deck, angled outward toward the assembled fleet, so that every ship within visual range could see the moment it happened. He decided the timing of the ceremony, morning, early, so the photographs would have good light and the radio broadcast would reach the largest possible audience across every time zone. He considered who would stand where, the arrangement of the ships, the precise timing of the flyover that would come at the end, and he made 2 invitations that no one on his staff had anticipated. General Jonathan Wainwright had commanded American forces in the Philippines after MacArthur left the islands in 1942. He had held Bataan and then Corregidor until there was nothing left to hold. He surrendered in May of 1942 and spent the next 3 years in Japanese prison camps, first in the Philippines, then in Manchuria. He had been found at a camp in Xi'an just weeks before, in August of 1945. He was alive. He was thin in the way that 3 years of a Japanese prison camp produces thinness. Not the thinness of a diet, but the thinness of systematic deprivation. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival had commanded British forces in Malaya and Singapore. He had surrendered Singapore to Japan in February of 1942, the largest surrender of British-led forces in the nation's history. He had been in the same camp as Wainwright for much of the war. MacArthur placed both men directly behind him at the signing table. He did not explain the decision publicly. He did not need to. The men who had surrendered to Japan in 1942 would stand behind the man accepting Japan's surrender in 1945. Every camera on that deck would record the same image. The Japanese delegation arrived aboard the destroyer, USS Lansdowne, at 8:56 in the morning. 11 delegates. They came up the gangway in order. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu came first. He had lost his leg to a bomb thrown by a Korean independence activist at a Japanese imperial celebration in Shanghai in April of 1932. Shigemitsu had worn a prosthetic leg for 13 years. He walked with a cane. The gangway from the Lansdowne to the Missouri's deck was not designed for a man with a cane and a prosthetic leg. He took it slowly. Some of those watching described the crossing as painful to observe. He reached the signing table. He sat down. He looked at the document in front of him. 8 paragraphs, the complete and unconditional surrender of the Empire of Japan. He appeared briefly uncertain which line he was supposed to sign. Sutherland leaned forward and pointed to the correct line. Shigemitsu signed at 9:04. General Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, signed at 9:06. Then it was MacArthur's turn. He signed with 6 pens. The first 2 went to Wainwright and Percival, the men standing directly behind him, the men who had spent 3 years in Japanese captivity, waiting for this morning. A third pen went to the United States Military Academy at West Point, a fourth to the military archives, a fifth to a close aide. The sixth, a plum-colored pen that did not match the others, went to his wife, Jean. He had prepared the list before he came aboard. When he finished, he stepped back from the table and moved to the microphone. He said he hoped that from this solemn occasion a better world would emerge, a world founded on faith and understanding, dedicated to the dignity of man and his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. Then he said, "Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always." These proceedings are closed. It was 9:25 in the morning. The ceremony had lasted 23 minutes. Overhead, almost immediately, came the sound. A low rumble that built into a roar as nearly 1,800 Allied aircraft swept over the Missouri in formation, so low and so dense that several men on deck said afterward they had turned the sky dark. MacArthur watched them pass. Then he turned and walked toward Admiral Halsey's cabin without looking back at the Japanese delegation. He put his arm around Halsey's shoulder and said, "Bill, where in the hell are those airplanes?" Halsey started to answer. MacArthur was already smiling. Kawabe Torishiro was not prosecuted at the Tokyo war crimes trials. The tribunal focused on the men who had designed Japan's aggression, ordered its atrocities, and built the machinery that had consumed millions of lives across Asia and the Pacific. Kawabe was not among them. He lived quietly after the war. He eventually wrote a memoir. It was never translated into English. In it, he described the 3 days in Manila as the longest of his life. Not because of what was demanded of him. The requirements were what they were, and he had accepted them. Not because of Sutherland, who had been cold but correct. Because of what he had seen through the window of that car on the drive from Nichols Field into what remained of the city. He did not call what he felt shame. He used a different word, one that translated more closely as weight. He wrote that the weight did not go away after Manila. He wrote that he was not sure it was supposed to. When Kawabe returned to Tokyo after those 3 days, he still had the vial. He had placed it in the inside pocket of his dress uniform jacket before he boarded the plane in Japan, in case the Americans turned out to be something other than gentlemen. The Americans had not been gentle exactly. They had not been cruel either. They had been something more unsettling than either. They had been indifferent to his rank in the way that people are indifferent to a distinction that no longer applies. No American soldier had stood at attention when he entered a room. No officer had acknowledged his position as a position that still carried weight. He had come to Manila in full dress uniform with his sword, with his medals prepared to be received as a general officer conducting the business of nations. He had been received as a man with a list of requirements to sign. He returned to Tokyo with the vial still in his pocket. He did not use it, not because the Americans had spared him anything, but because 3 days in Manila had made the outcome feel permanent. The war was over. Not officially, that came later on the Missouri, but in the way that matters more, in the place where a man carries his understanding of what is true. It was over on the tarmac at Nichols Field in the August heat, with no one coming out to meet him. MacArthur understood something that does not appear in any order of battle or any after-action report. He understood that the end of a war is not only a military event, it is a psychological one. And sometimes the most precise weapon a commander possesses is the deliberate, considered decision to make the other side wait and to let the waiting do what no confrontation could accomplish on its own. The Missouri ended the war on paper. Manila ended it in the minds of the men who came to arrange it. Those are not always the same moment. In this case, they were 11 days apart. July 24th, 1943, west of Truk, 10 minutes past 10 in the morning. A Japanese oil tanker sat dead in the water. No engine, no escort, no way to run. 1,000 yards away, an American submarine lined up its shot. The kind of shot that every training manual called perfect. The right distance, the right angle. The torpedo left the tube. The men on the tanker's deck saw the white wake coming toward them. Some of them shouted. Some of them ran. A few just stood at the rail and watched. The torpedo hit the hull with a heavy, dull thud. Nothing happened. The men on deck looked at each other. This was the first torpedo to strike their ship from that position. It would not be the last. Now here is what makes that impossible to understand. The men firing those torpedoes were not making mistakes. They were doing everything right. The submarine was exactly where it was supposed to be. The torpedoes ran straight and true every time. The most advanced anti-ship weapon the United States Navy had ever put to sea was hitting a target it could not miss, and it was killing no one. By the end of that day, 11 torpedoes would strike the Tonen Maru No. 3. 11 direct hits. 11 times, nothing. And the answer to why that happened, the real answer, had been sitting in a drawer in Washington before the war even started. Someone knew and they didn't fix it. To understand what happened on July 24th, 1943, you need to understand what the Tonen Maru No. 3 actually was. She was not a warship. She had never been built for war. The Tonen Maru No. 3 was launched in Osaka in May of 1938. She weighed more than 19,000 tons. She stretched 534 ft from bow to stern. At the time of her launch, she was the largest merchant vessel ever built in Japan, and she was a whale factory ship. That is not a figure of speech. Her entire purpose, every inch of her design, was to process whales at sea. She carried crews of men trained to work with long-handled knives on a reinforced aft deck fitted with winches and cutting rails. When a whale was harpooned and pulled alongside, they stripped the blubber in layers, fed it into onboard digesters, and boiled it down into oil. The oil went to soap factories, to margarine plants, to industrial lubricant production across Japan. She was a floating assembly line built to operate for months at a time in the coldest, most remote waters on Earth, the South Atlantic, the Antarctic, without returning to port. For 3 seasons before the war, she led a fleet of smaller hunting vessels through those waters. In the 1938-39 season alone, her fleet caught 1,400 whales. She was enormous and she was tough, not because anyone expected her to be shot at, but because industrial ships in rough seas have to be. Her hull was heavily compartmentalized. Her construction was built for endurance, not combat. None of that was designed to stop a torpedo. It just turned out that it helped. When Japan entered the war in December 1941, the Imperial Navy requisitioned her. The processing equipment came out. Fuel oil storage tanks went in. The Tonen Maru No. 3 became a tanker, one of the largest in the Japanese fleet and one of the most valuable. By the summer of 1943, Japan's ability to move oil across the Pacific was under enormous strain. American submarines had already sent dozens of tankers to the bottom. Every ship that completed a run from the oil fields of Borneo to the fleet anchorages at Truk mattered more than the one before it. The Japanese military ran on fuel. Their aircraft ran on fuel. Their warships ran on fuel. Cut the fuel and the whole machine slows down. American submariners knew this. It was the central logic of the entire Pacific submarine campaign. On July 23, 1943, the Tonen Maru No. 3 departed Truk and headed southwest toward Miri on the coast of Borneo to take on another load of oil. She had made this run before. She would not finish this one. At least that is what should have happened. The man hunting her was Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit. His crew called him Dan. Daspit had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1927. He had spent 15 years learning how submarines worked, how they moved, how they fought. By the summer of 1943, he was considered one of the sharpest boat commanders in the Pacific Submarine Force. His submarine was the USS Tinosa, a Gado-class boat commissioned in January of that year. The Tinosa had just completed her first war patrol in the waters east of Kyushu. She had damaged 3 Japanese ships. She had taken depth charge hits and kept going. Now she was on her second patrol, working the shipping lanes between Borneo and Truk, exactly the stretch of ocean the Tonen Maru would be crossing. On the evening of July 23rd, Daspit received an Ultra intercept. Ultra was the code name for intelligence derived from broken enemy communications, the most closely guarded secret in the American war effort. Only a handful of officers knew it existed. The intercept told Daspit that a large Japanese tanker would be transiting through his patrol area the following day. It gave him coordinates. It gave him timing. It was the kind of message a submarine commander spent an entire patrol hoping to receive. Daspit set a course to intercept. That night, his torpedo men went through their standard checks, the same careful, methodical inspection they performed before every attack. The Tinosa was carrying Mark 14 torpedoes, the Navy's standard submarine weapon, and Daspit had every reason to trust them. The Mark 14 had been troubled early in the war. That much was no secret inside the submarine force. In the first months of fighting, commanders had reported torpedoes running too deep, passing harmlessly beneath their targets. That problem had been identified and corrected by August 1942. Then came a second problem. The magnetic exploder, the device designed to detonate the torpedo as it passed beneath a ship's keel, was triggering too early, blowing up in open water before reaching the target. That problem had been addressed as well. Just weeks before Tinosa left Midway, Admiral Nimitz himself had ordered the magnetic exploders disabled on all Pacific submarines. Two problems found, two problems corrected. As far as Daspit knew, the Mark 14 in his torpedo tubes was finally the weapon it was always supposed to be. He had no reason to think otherwise. At 4 in the morning on July 24th, the Tinosa was on station running on the surface in position ahead of the tanker's projected route. At 5:55 a.m., the sky was clear. The sea was calm. Daspit raised the periscope. The Tonin Maru No. 3 appeared on the horizon. 19,000 tons of steel riding low in the water, with a full load of fuel making 13 knots and sailing without a single escort vessel in sight. She was not zigzagging. A ship that size in those waters in wartime sailing in a straight line. It was the kind of target that almost never happened. Daspit watched her for a moment through the glass. Then he began to set up his attack. At 8:09 in the morning, Daspit took the Tinosa down. He maneuvered into position ahead of the tanker's path, angled to intercept, and waited. At 9:23, he fired 4 torpedoes from the bow tubes. The approach had been textbook. The firing solution was clean. Every calculation checked out. 30 seconds later, the sonar man heard impacts. Solid, unmistakable thumps against a steel hull. At least 2 of the 4 had hit the hull. Neither exploded. The Tonin Maru dropped 4 depth charges, a reflexive response, scatter and hope, then turned hard away and pushed her engines to full. For a ship that size, full speed was not fast. But she was moving now, and the angle had changed. Daspit swung the Tinosa around and chased. It was an unequal race. A submerged Guadalcanal submarine could make about 9 knots underwater. The Tonin Maru was already pulling 13. Daspit could not close the gap submerged. He tracked her, adjusted, and waited for the geometry to work in his favor. It did. At 9:38, with the tanker pulling away at an angle, Daspit fired 2 more torpedoes from the bow tubes. The firing position was not ideal. The torpedoes would strike the hull obliquely, not the clean perpendicular hit the manuals preferred. Under normal circumstances, an experienced commander would keep maneuvering for a better angle, but Daspit fired anyway. Both torpedoes hit the Tonin Maru aft on the port quarter. Both of them exploded. The blast tore into her engine room. Black smoke poured from the hull. The tanker's engines went silent. She listed to port and coasted to a stop, settling slightly by the stern. On her decks, men were already moving toward the lifeboats. To the crew of the Tonin Maru, this was the moment the ship was dying. 2 explosions, a list, no power. The math of that situation pointed in one direction. They had no way of knowing that those 2 explosions, the only 2 that would happen all day, had already spent themselves. Daspit did not know that either. What he saw through the periscope was everything a submarine commander could ask for. A 19,000-ton tanker, dead in the water, no escort in any direction. A full load of torpedoes still in his tubes. He came around to the tanker's starboard side. He set up at 875 yards directly abeam at a right angle to the hull. This was the shot the Navy trained every submarine commander to take. Close range, stationary target, perpendicular impact, maximum damage guaranteed. There was no urgency, no threat. The Tonin Maru could not run and could not fight back effectively. Daspit had time to do this exactly right. He steadied the Tinosa. He confirmed the firing solution. He gave the order. The torpedo left the tube at 10:09. It ran straight and true. A clean white line through the water, aimed directly at the stopped tanker's hull. It struck and the sea went quiet. Daspit fired again. 10-11, another torpedo, another straight run, another solid impact. Nothing. 10-14, a third torpedo. Clean hit, nothing. 3 torpedoes, 3 confirmed hits, a stationary target at close range. No explosions. Daspit ordered a halt. He was not a man who panicked. He was not a man who jumped to conclusions. What he did next was exactly what a careful, experienced commander would do when the evidence stopped making sense. He had his torpedo men pull every remaining torpedo from its tube and inspect it. Every spring, every pin, every mechanism. They went through each weapon the way a surgeon checks his instruments before an operation. It took time. The Tonen Maru sat out there listing, smoking, going nowhere. The torpedo men finished their inspection. Their verdict: every torpedo was in perfect working order. Not one fault found, not one component out of place. Daspit climbed back to the periscope. The tanker was still there. He resumed the attack. 10:39, 900 yards. A dead-on impact. Nothing. 10:48, 1,000 yards. This one hit the hull. And then something happened that Daspit would spend years trying to explain to himself. The torpedo did not sink. It did not simply fail to explode. It bounced. It struck the port side aft, threw up a splash at the waterline, then visibly changed direction, veered hard to the right, broke the surface, and leapt clear of the water nearly 100 feet from the tanker's stern. Then it sank. Daspit wrote in his patrol log, "This torpedo hit well aft on the port side, made a splash at the side of the ship, and was then observed to have taken a right turn and to jump clear of the water about 100 ft from the stern of the tanker. I find it hard to convince myself that I saw this." He fired again and again and again. Hit, no effect. Hit, no effect. Hit, no effect. On the Tonen Maru's deck, something had shifted. The men who had climbed into the lifeboats were climbing back out. They had watched torpedo after torpedo strike their ship and disappear. They had waited for the blast that never came. And somewhere in that waiting, the fear had turned into something else entirely. They opened fire. A deck gun and machine guns swung toward the thin line of Tenosa's periscope cutting through the surface. They fired at the torpedo wakes. They fired at anything that moved. They were shooting at a submarine with deck guns. It was not an effective tactic, but it said something about what those men believed, that whatever was happening to the torpedoes, they were no longer waiting to die. At 11:32, a shape appeared on the horizon, a Japanese destroyer moving fast, called in by the Tonen Maru's distress signal. She was 1,000 yards out and closing. Daspit made a decision. He had 1 torpedo left. He fired it. It ran clean. It hit. It did not explode. He wrote in the log, "No explosion." He had already decided to retain 1 torpedo for examination by base. He took the Tenosa down to 300 free, 7 depth charges fell. Close enough to rattle the hull, close enough to hear through the steel. The crew held still in the dark and waited. After 2 hours, the charges stopped. At 1:57 in the afternoon, Daspit brought the Tenosa back up to periscope depth. The Tonen Maru was still afloat 3 miles away down by the stern. The destroyer was alongside. 15 torpedoes, 13 confirmed hits, 11 duds. Daspit surfaced after dark and sent his contact report to Pearl Harbor. 3 hours later, the order came back. Return to base. He set a course for Pearl Harbor with 1 unexploded torpedo locked in its tube. The only evidence he had that any of this had actually happened. What happened to Daspit was not an accident. It was not bad luck. It was not a malfunction that came out of nowhere. It was the end of a line that had been running since the first week of the war. December 14th, 1941, 7 days after Pearl Harbor, the USS Seawolf was hunting Japanese shipping off the coast of the Philippines. Her commander found a target, set up a clean attack, and fired a spread of torpedoes. One of them hit. It did not explode. The Seawolf's crew heard the impact through the hull, that same dull metallic thud that Daspit's crew would hear 19 months later over and over again. No one in Washington believed it yet. In the first 3 months of the war, American submarines fired 97 torpedoes at Japanese shipping. They sank 3 ships. 3. Some of those torpedoes had missed. Some had detonated prematurely, blowing up in open water before they reached anything. And some had hit their target squarely and simply refused to explode. The submarines were not crewed by amateurs. These were experienced men trained for years operating equipment they knew better than anyone. They knew something was wrong. They said so. Patrol report after patrol report came back to submarine command with the same language. Torpedoes running erratic. Torpedoes failing to detonate. Targets hit and targets lost. The Bureau of Ordnance, the Navy office responsible for designing and producing the weapons, had a consistent answer. The problem was not the torpedo. The problem was the men firing it. Bad approaches, they said. Poor maintenance. Operator error. A Bureau of Ordnance officer was sent out to inspect one submarine's torpedoes personally. He examined the weapons. He reviewed the crew's procedures. He submitted a report placing the blame squarely on the men aboard the boat. When one submarine commander requested permission to conduct a simple test, fire a torpedo through a submerged fishing net to measure how deep it was actually running, his request was denied. He received a reprimand instead. By the middle of 1942, American submarines had fired more than 800 torpedoes in the Pacific War. 80% had failed. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood had seen enough. Lockwood had taken command of submarines in the Southwest Pacific in May 1942, based in Fremantle, Australia. He was a career submariner, not an administrator, not a politician. He read his commander patrol reports and he believed them. Without authorization, he conducted his own test. He had torpedoes fired through a submerged net in a quiet bay off the Australian coast. The holes in the net told the story that 800 combat-fired torpedoes had been trying to tell for 8 months. The torpedoes were running 11 ft deeper than their depth settings indicated. 11 ft to run on torpedoes set to run at 10 ft was actually running at 21. Passing clean beneath the hulls it was aimed at. Lockwood brought the evidence to the Bureau of Ordnance. The Bureau disputed the methodology. It took direct intervention from Admiral Nimitz to force the Bureau to run their own tests. They confirmed the problem in August 1942, 8 months into the war. A fix was designed and distributed, and then a new problem appeared. With the depth issue corrected, the torpedoes were finally hitting their targets. But now they were exploding too soon, detonating in open water dozens of yards short. The blast was wasted on nothing. The culprit was the magnetic exploder, a device designed to trigger the warhead as it passed through the magnetic field beneath a ship's keel. The concept was sound. The execution was not. The magnetic field around a ship changes depending on where in the world you are. The exploder had been calibrated in the waters off New England. The Pacific is not New England. Germany had discovered the same flaw in their own magnetic exploders and abandoned the technology entirely by mid-1941. Britain had followed. The United States did not. Submarine commanders disabled the magnetic exploders on their own initiative quietly against orders because the alternative was watching their weapons blow up 50 yards short of everything they aimed at. It was not until June 1943, a full year and a half into the war, that Admiral Nimitz ordered the magnetic exploders disabled on all Pacific submarines. 2 problems identified, 2 problems corrected. That was the state of things when Daspit took the Tinosa out of Midway in July 1943. He had been told the Mark 14 was ready. He had every reason to believe it. What no one knew, what no one could have known, because no one had ever run the tests that would have shown it, was that the torpedo was still broken, just in a different way. And the only way to find it was to fire enough torpedoes at a sitting target to make the pattern undeniable. Daspit had just done that. He was the first man who had. The Tinosa arrived at Pearl Harbor on August 4, 1943. Daspit went straight from the dock to the office of Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarines Pacific Fleet. He brought the torpedo with him. Lockwood later wrote that he had braced himself for what he expected would be a sustained and well-deserved outburst. What he got instead was something harder to watch. Daspit was too angry to shout. He laid out what had happened, the approach, the position, the 15 shots, the 13 hits, the 11 failures in the flat, precise language of a man who has gone over the same facts so many times in his own head that the emotion has worn down to something cold. Lockwood wrote, "I think Dan was so furious as to be practically speechless. His tale was almost unbelievable, but the evidence was undeniable." The torpedo Daspit had carried back from the Pacific was taken to the submarine-based torpedo shop and examined by the Navy's own ordnance specialists. They checked every component, every mechanism, every moving part. The same verdict came back. The torpedo was in perfect working order. There was nothing wrong with it. Lockwood did not accept that as the final word. He called in Commander Charles Momsen, one of the most respected technical minds in the submarine force, and told him to find the answer. Momsen's proposal was straightforward. Take a submarine out to the waters off Kahulawe, a small uninhabited island southwest of Maui, and fire live torpedoes directly into the cliff face. Recover the ones that didn't explode, take them apart, see what the impact had done to them. On August 31st, 1943, a submarine positioned herself off the cliffs of Kahulawe and began firing. The first torpedo exploded on impact. The second torpedo exploded on impact. The third torpedo hit the cliff and did not explode. Divers went down. They recovered the weapon carefully. An unexploded torpedo lodged in rock is not something you handle quickly, and brought it back to the surface. The engineers at Pearl Harbor took it apart on a workbench. What they found was this. When a torpedo traveling at 46 knots strikes a steel hull at a perfect right angle, the force of that impact is enormous, far greater than the force generated by a glancing or oblique hit. The contact exploder was designed with a firing pin that had to travel a precise distance to strike the detonator cap and trigger the warhead. The firing pin moved on guide rails. At the moment of a direct perpendicular impact, the deceleration force was so sudden and so violent that it crushed the guide rails before the firing pin could complete its travel. The rails bent, the pin jammed, and the detonator was never struck. The torpedo hit, but the mechanism destroyed itself on contact. The warhead never knew it had arrived. At an oblique angle, a less than perfect hit, the impact force was lower. The guide rails held. The firing pin moved. The torpedo exploded. This was the reason Daspit's first 2 torpedoes had worked and the next 11 had not. The 2 that exploded were fired at a bad angle while the tanker was still running. The 11 that failed were fired from the position every submarine commander had been trained to seek out. The better the shot, the less likely it would kill anything. The engineers traced the flaw back to its origin. The firing pin assembly had been tested at the Naval Torpedo Station during the 1930s, but tested at the speeds of 1930s torpedoes, which ran at roughly 30 knots. By the time the war started, the Mark 14 was running at 46 knots. No one had gone back to test the firing pin at the new speed. No one had asked whether a mechanism that worked at 30 knots would survive the forces generated at 46. The answer, it turned out, was no. The fix was not complicated. The torpedo shop at Pearl Harbor redesigned the firing pin assembly using a lighter alloy, a metal that could move fast enough to beat the impact force before the guide rails gave way. The raw material came from damaged aircraft propellers collected from Henderson Field, the Army Air Force's base just down the road from Pearl Harbor. The propellers were melted down. New firing pins were machined from the metal, tested, confirmed, distributed to the fleet. By October 1943, submarines going to sea finally carried a torpedo that would explode when it was supposed to. 22 months after the war began, 3 separate flaws, 3 separate fixes, each one found in the field by the men who were dying from it over the sustained resistance of the office that had built the weapon and could not admit what they had sent to war. Historian Clay Blair, who wrote the definitive account of the American submarine campaign, described the outcome plainly. After 21 months of war, all 3 major defects of the Mark 14 had at last been identified. Every single one had been discovered and fixed in the field. Every single one over the stubborn opposition of the Bureau of Ordnance. The Tonin Maru No. 3 did not sink that day. Light cruiser Isuzu arrived from Truk and took her under tow. She was repaired. She returned to service. On February 17, 1944, 7 months after Daspit fired 15 torpedoes into her hull, American carrier aircraft struck Truk in force. The operation was called Hailstone. 5 carriers, hundreds of aircraft. The Tonan Maru No. 3 was sunk in the lagoon, not by a torpedo, but by bombs dropped from the sky. After the war, Japan petitioned for special permission to raise her. She was too valuable to leave on the bottom, the largest vessel Japan had ever built, and the country needed her for the fishing fleet. Salvage crews refloated her in 1951. She was rebuilt and returned to service. She went back to the Antarctic, back to the whaling grounds she had worked before any of this happened. She was finally scrapped in 1971, 33 years after she was launched, 28 years after a submarine fired 15 torpedoes into her hull, and she refused to die. Daspit was promoted to commander. The Tenosa completed 12 war patrols in total. She was credited with sinking 16 Japanese ships, every one of them after the torpedo was fixed. The question that history has never answered cleanly is the question of cost. Not the cost of fixing the torpedo. That was a few weeks of work and a pile of scrap propellers from a field in Hawaii. The cost of not fixing it sooner. How many Japanese ships crossed the Pacific safely with unexploded American torpedoes buried in their hulls? How many American submarines were lost while pressing attacks against targets they should have been able to sink on the first pass? How many men on both sides paid the price for a firing pin that no one had thought to test at the right speed? History does not keep columns for the things that should have happened and didn't. It only records what did. 11 hits, 11 silences, and a ship that was built to chase whales in the Antarctic, lying at the bottom of a lagoon on a Pacific island most people will never visit, sunk in the end by the weapon that should have killed her the first time. If these stories of resilience and the hidden turning points of the Pacific War have changed how you look at history, please subscribe and like the channel. We are excavating the past that they tried to bury. Let us plant the seeds for the future together. The next treasury of history will open soon.